Hey folks, let's go and talk about surveying people. Of course, one way of surveying people is to creepily stare into their windows, particularly when they're watching TV at night. However, that is problematic for a couple reasons. First, it's illegal, and second, if you do it, there's probably something wrong with you morally, right? And so I can't recommend that as an approach. So instead, I'm going to recommend that you produce digital surveys for your big product design project. But in order to do that, you need to know something about surveys and how they work. And so that's the purpose of this video, is to give you some basic facts about survey design, right? So the first thing I want to say before we get into anything else is I want to talk a little bit about open-ended questions. So these are questions where people can write a short paragraph or give some sort of discursive answer or something along those lines, right? Open-ended questions tend to be problematic on surveys, and there's a couple of reasons for that, right? The first reason is that people tend to take surveys really quickly, and so they don't tend to provide very detailed responses. And so at most, you're going to get a phrase, a sentence, maybe an irrelevant joke, that sort of thing. And so very often, you don't get the best answers to open-ended questions on surveys, right? And if you do ask them, the other thing to keep in mind is they're a real pain to analyze. So you got to look through all the different questions, look at some patterns in the responses, figure out how you're going to quantify that. It's a real pain in the butt, right? And so at most, I recommend asking like one open-ended question, maybe at the end of the survey, and it's perfectly fine if you don't include any at all, right? And so that's just something to keep in mind. If you're interested in those kinds of rich, detailed answers to questions, the better approach is to do an interview, right? And that's just not possible given the online class format and the time restrictions in the class, right? So anyway, so for the most part, you should avoid open-ended questions in your survey, right? But when you are designing your questions, there are some things to consider. There's basically 3 different topics that you should think about, right? So one of them is the order of the questions. So what goes first, what goes last, so on and so forth. One is the content. So what kind of material are you going to ask for, that sort of thing. And the last is type. So what kind of questions do you want to ask? And so we're going to go ahead and take each of these in turn, right? And as far as question order goes, there's basically one big principle, right? You want to start with easy questions, and you want to build towards more difficult ones, right? Anything that requires any contemplation should be saved towards the end of an interview, right? Or end of a survey, I'm sorry. So a good example of a survey question that you might start with is something like this. How frequently do you play video games each week, right? Anybody who plays video games probably has an easy answer to this question. They're immediately going to be able to answer it without any thought, right? And so that's a good question to start with, right? Now, if you're going to ask anything sensitive, right, you should put it towards the end of an interview. So anything about politics, religion, sexuality, that sort of stuff, those things are best to save for the end, right? So, for example, the question, I am satisfied with my sex life. You strongly agree to strongly disagree. Save that for the end of a survey, right? Now, I don't say this to force you to avoid sensitive questions, right? You can ask questions about, like, sexuality if you want to, right? But you need to wait until people have some investment in the survey before you do that, right? If you ask like a question like this at the beginning, they might not take you seriously. Click the X button before they move forward, right? If you ask this at the end, they've already answered a whole bunch of questions, so they're more likely to just go ahead and do it at that point, right? So anyways, sensitive questions that require contemplation, save those for the end of your survey. The second thing you need to consider is the content of your questions, so what kind of material you're going to ask for, right? And the main thing you want to avoid here is leading questions. So any kind of questions that guide the reader towards a particular kind of response should be avoided. So for example, why are people dumb enough to buy Tide laundry detergent when other options are just as effective? That's probably not the best question to ask, right? And the reason for that is you're applying a certain opinion about Tide laundry detergent. If they agree with you, they're predisposed to answer in a way that you're going to find favorable, right? If they disagree with you, answering the question is going to be awkward, right? And so it's best to just avoid those kinds of questions altogether, right? And of course, it's easier to say to avoid leading questions than it is to actually do that in practice, right? And so a number of you will probably have to revise your questions because they're leading in one way or the other after I look at your survey, right? The second thing is always ask demographic questions. And particularly that means questions related to age and gender. You must ask those in every particular survey, I think, right? But in addition, there may be other demographic questions you want to ask. So things like race, income, relationship status, marriage status, sexual orientation, all those might be relevant depending on the kind of product that you're working on, right? So thou must always ask age and gender, right? Other questions might be necessary depending on the topic. Just remember, the whole point of a survey is to look at differences between different groups of people, and it's hard to do that if you're not asking these basic demographic questions. And so, so keep that in mind when you're designing your survey. The final thing is question type. So what type of questions you should ask. And my main advice here is to avoid ranking questions if you can, right? Ranking questions are where you ask someone to put something in order of preference. And so this example here is, rank your favorite place to buy fresh produce. 1 best, 5 worst, right? And the first is, hopefully everyone puts 5 for Pennywise, because he's the evil clown from the show It. And if you're buying your produce from a evil clown that's hiding in the sewer, there's definitely something wrong with you. But otherwise, the problem here is that people might have similar opinions on things, right? So they may think that Albertsons and Sprouts are about the same or something along those lines. And it's difficult to see that kind of nuance with a question like that, right? Like this, right? So instead, you want to frame these questions in terms of Likert scale style questions. And indeed, most of your survey is probably going to be composed of Likert scale style questions. And these are ones where you provide some sort of scale, usually of 5 items that people can use in response, right? So for example, you see here, I think that the green Fruit Loops taste better than the red ones. Strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? This is only one kind of Likert scale. There are a lot of other different types. So there's frequency scales and all kinds of things. I'm going to post a link on GauchoSpace that shows you the most common kinds of Likert scales that are used, and you can borrow those when you're fabricating your survey questions. Now, one thing I'm going to say about Likert scales is try to make them as consistent as possible, right? And so if you use a agreement scale at one point in the survey, see if you can use an agreement scale as often as possible. And that makes things a little smoother and makes it easier for people to take the survey themselves, right? And this is just a general principle for survey design in general, right? So as consistent as you can make it, the easier it is going to be for your survey takers to take. I think that's the right way to put that. Anyway, so I want to say a few quick words about Likert scales because I think it's important to understand why they're preferred by a lot of researchers, right? And so I just want you to compare 2 different responses to this question, right? So the first is, I wouldn't date people who play Dungeons & Dragons because they are losers. Agree, disagree, right? So if you look at a sample, like a possible set of results to this particular question, right? You're going to see here that the amount of agreement and disagreement is relatively constant, right? So people seem to agree or disagree in roughly similar numbers, right? And so that leads you to believe that people are split, right? That there's sort of an even divide on this particular issue, right? So asking the question this way is going to generate these kinds of responses, right? Now compare this to the Likert scale that offers a variety of different options, right? So from strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? And let's pretend you get this response instead for this particular question, right? So what you're going to see is there are lots of people that strongly agree, right? While on the other side, there are also lots of people that disagree, but there isn't as much enthusiasm on that particular question, right? And so there's less people strongly disagreeing, and there's just some of those people that are disagreeing, right? And so this tells you something about people's attitudes in this question, right? And so people that would not date someone who plays Dungeons & Dragons, people who strongly agree, right, are much more enthusiastic about their opinion than people who would date somebody who plays Dungeons & Dragons, people who disagree, right? And so that gives you a much different picture of the responses to the survey, right? And so that's why people prefer Likert scale style questions. It allows them to explore an issue with more sensitivity and more nuance, right? So to recap, just a few things about survey design. So you want to start as much as possible with easy questions and build towards more difficult ones, right? You always want to ask demographic questions, regardless of the circumstance. Age and gender always being the most important ones. You want to avoid leading questions as much as you possibly can, right? So let the survey taker answer the questions however they want to, right? You want to integrate Likert scale style questions as much as possible, right? And those are the basic principles that you should follow whenever you're designing a survey, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pause here, and then I'm going to start a second video. I'm going to attach a second video that shows how to create surveys using Google Forms.